Welcome to this Connect M3 Thought Byte podcast recorded on the 12th of December. It's titled Rich Nation, Poor People, and the strapline is "This situation will only persist for as long as people allow it to." Those knowing their flags of nation states will immediately recognize the disconnection between the title for this thought bite and its relevance to the state of Belgium. But the two things are very much connected. And this rather odd and surprising connection is not really the reason for writing this thought bite, which is better described as the sharing of an idea. Instead, the connection of the two was the trigger to share a thought for something we might all start to contemplate. It concerns the rich and the poor in this world and a fundamental way of fixing the imbalance. I have thought for some long while, like many others have, that the policy statements we hear from the World Economic Forum, the WEF, sound in most cases quite reasonable. The thought which always follows every time, in my case at least, is that these WF ideas sound pretty good, but not with those guys leading them. For us others, with a reasonable level of acquaintance with those WEF ideas, we'll know that they are couched to sound more than reasonable to anyone. But, as this is a big but, the underlying agenda, which is formulated by the very richest people and corporates of this world, buying the influence of all the major state politicians as they do, is anything but attractive. Here I give mention to an interesting recording of a senior BlackRock employee, in secret I add, explaining how easy and cheap it is to buy a politician's support. BlackRock, of course, is one of the WEF set and a key partner in the WEF directives decided on at the annual gathering in Davos. At this point, I'd like to offer my own simplistic view of the world as it is today, or so it appears to me. Over a relatively short span of years, measured in decades, closing in on a century now perhaps, things in the hierarchical scheme of things have changed massively. That change has been the growth of the corporates, big biz. And near the top of the tree in the New World Order of things are companies like BlackRock. Others include Vanguard Group, State Street Corporation, JP Chase, and Berkshire Hathaway, all American in origin, as they are. These giant corporations are so big they're richer in monetary terms than many nation states, and the influence they can exercise over those states and others is nothing short of frightening to most. They include Elon Musk. So, where we are all currently, and certainly where we are headed in the years directly ahead of us, is here, a new world order of things. In the top slot, at number 1, running the world and dictating policy, big biz. In the second slot, the puppet masters. They are the politicians telling us what we can and can't do. And third slot, at the bottom, is everyone else. That's you, me, and everyone. There's an enlightening documentary on this subject called Monopoly, Who Owns the World? It's absorbing and an excellent educational 63 minutes that will stick in your mind. But before the likes of JP Morgan and BlackRock took to the stage, something really key happened in history, and it was probably bound to. Before getting to that, however, allow me to open this section with another reference to the WEF. We've all heard its leader speak. It's his mantra. You will own nothing and be happy. And that, incidentally, applies to our very clothes also. Sky News described this mantra by leader Klaus Schwab so perfectly. And a short documentary takes the subject a little further, and it's called The Plan. Is this the plan exposed? A question then. If we are to own nothing and be happy, who then will own everything? Can you see who they are yet? If not, do take a guess. But what about this idea? What if we owned everything? We would be even happier, right? So back to the history bit, and here I introduce Belgium as a case in point. Powerful leaders around the world of one type or another, and for millennia, have careered around invading lands, killing the locals, and raping the local assets. This was all done as if those lands and assets were their own. Well, they weren't, as we all know. In effect, the lands and the assets were just taken, stolen, if you like, from the people who cared for those lands and only used the assets they needed to survive. The Native American stories of the 1800s will come to mind now. In present day, the law in most nation states has us believe, and quite fairly, that if we are in possession of stolen goods, we are not entitled to keep them. Those goods are returned to their rightful owner and without compensation to the innocent party, and that's ouch, who may have paid for them in what was accepted and seen to be as an honest transaction. A transaction which may have taken the look of being all very neat, signed, sealed and delivered, like in the purchase of a house and the consequent transfer of title deeds. Now, with the previous thinking about theft in mind, consider this idea. I would postulate that no person alive or dead has or has had rightful ownership of any land anywhere, or the assets that may have been naturally present on or below those lands at any point in time. This would mean all property transactions since time zero would effectively be declared null and void. And how mad does this sound, you may be thinking? Well, I urge you to ponder on the idea and consider what it might mean in another reality. Our next reality, perhaps, if all of us people were to opt for this idea. Let's look at this real example from history. The King of Belgium takes his men into the depths of Africa. He invades an area of land which today is known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. He takes possession of the lands and the assets. The king didn't acquire the lands or the assets legitimately. He just took possession of them and thus did not acquire legitimate legal title. Basically, he stole them. He probably had some protesting local types to see off in the process. Actually, this isn't really how things happened with King Leopold II of Belgium and the DRC, although it is believable since many nations took possession of others' assets in exactly this way. No, the real story of these two nations is explained in an article by The Conversation. We title it Europe's Dirty Business. Basically, the DRC was stitched up by a group of Europeans in a meeting excluding any Africans. The end result, however, was exactly the same: exploitation of the riches stolen by Belgium. So if the king failed to gain legitimate legal title, except in the way that was deemed legitimate by a group of Europeans doing deals in private, it means that every land and asset transaction that has ever occurred since in the history of the DRC is actually null and void by definition. Boom. Now ask yourself, what else, where else in the world has this claiming of land and assets taken place? Correct. Everywhere. Meaning that by definition, every land and asset transaction that has ever taken place, and I mean ever, is null and void. Boom again. And if that is the case, who then do the lands and assets actually belong to? Well, no one, except perhaps us, meaning us ordinary Joes of this world. Some would say the lands and everything are all gifts of God, which means gifted to us all, you'd think. This means not just a few, even if they think of themselves as being God's chosen ones. A rather odd concept, in my view. Imagine then that all the lands and all the assets above and below are owned by the collective us. For example, let's say each of us holds a share certificate in all the above, 1 share per living person. Each share being non-redeemable, non-transferable, and certainly not saleable, or available as a guarantee for borrowing purposes. Imagine the certificate saying, in heavy print, whilst the above-named individual remains a living person and planet Earth continues to be their chosen place of domicile, they shall hold this certificate of guardianship, exercising what powers they have or hold to the extent they can be applied for the purpose of fulfilling their role of joint guardian of planet Earth, as a joint owner with entitlement to receive benefits and dividends as shall apply over time, determined by the joint elected trustees. Moving on, let's now take the course whereby we each rent a share of those lands and assets at a price which is deemed fair and reasonable, all things considered. The rents we all pay are paid into the collective's pot where it benefits all the people. There are multiple ways in which those benefits could accrue to everyone, and they would be significant and certain to outweigh the rent charge for all reasonable family homes. It is here, though, that we see the possibilities of a much fairer world emerging, where the asset ownership thing, or rather asset usage thing, is spread more widely and more fairly, where the combined benefit is shared among us all equally. This idea will not go down well with any of the power-rich class, the PRCs, or any of those big biz corporates that show up at Davos every year to support the aims and ambitions of the WEF. But the PRCs are a very small minority of souls who would doubtless be disappointed with this change in direction. That said, some of the few may come to see this concept of joint ownership as I do, and now perhaps you too, after reading this. It could happen some of the few could even be happy about it one day. It is possible. Returning to the King of Belgium for a moment. Recently, DW News produced a short but enlightening 15-minute video about the DRC and the Belgian King. What the piece describes is that the DRC is one of the richest nations in the world, thanks to the rich resources it has buried in its lands. This should mean that the DRC people could be, among the richest people in the world. Well, they aren't. In reality, they are among the poorest. The ownership of the lands and the assets beneath them have either been sold to third parties or rented to them for huge financial gain. What this has meant, ignoring the corrupt politicians who've had their noses in the trough like they do anywhere else, is that Big Biz has got the riches instead. In consequence, the native population have had to scratch for a living, working in dangerous conditions, mining the minerals we all use in our smartphones, EVs, and other toys in our day-to-day lives in other nations. As a point of interest, 3 of the most valuable minerals dug out of the ground in DRC, often literally by hand, include coal, gold, cobalt, and coltan. These are the very minerals used in numerous production processes for high-ticket consumer goods, including smartphones and EV batteries for electric cars and lorries. The story of the DRC and EV batteries, which is at the root of government drives to get us all electric by 2050 or sooner, is something worthy of deeper study. A Channel 4 24-minute documentary explains about the mining in DRC. I gave mention to the Belgian King grabbing his piece of the cake. Many nations around the world have done similar things over the centuries and have gained enormous wealth and with it control, including in particular the UK. The background story about the British monarchy is also quite absorbing and in more ways than many of us might imagine. I provide a link in the PDF version, the notes, link F, to a documentary that seeks to explain a particular truth about the British royals. I include it here as part of this thought bite, given its assertions about the enormous undeclared wealth this minute group of people enjoy. There are other revelations made in the documentary which are beyond the scope of this piece today. The theme looked at in the documentary, link F, is the enormous wealth that has been stolen and accumulated by all kinds of people and groups over many centuries, including the last and extending into the current. Here we could look at Ukraine and at Palestine, and will another day. In this case, however, this particular story, centres on the British royals. The reality behind what's going on isn't easy to take on board. It should cause us to ponder deeply on what's happening and what is being planned to happen. If, however, we all remain focused on doing the right thing for our fellows wherever they live on this planet, we can be confident we'll be doing the right thing for each other and for our own conscience. For the inquisitive among us, do see the collection of links in the notes that I referred to. Speaking directly to you as an inquisitive type, I've included there a number of additional interesting documentaries and articles. These will take the inquisitor a little further along this route of discovery and may be a timely reinvention for the benefit of us all, including in particular the children of the DRC, mining the minerals for our proud to own smartphones and EVs. Well, I hope I've sown a seed with this idea of common, shared ownership. I think it could happen, should happen even. But what do you think? Thank you for listening to this Thought Bite today. I hope it's given you further things to think about on this thought-provoking subject. The articles and documentaries I refer to are listed at the end of the PDF version of this Thought Bite. There you'll find additional links to further information on the subject covered, including links to many other enlightening and fascinating articles on a variety of topics. Meanwhile, I look forward to sharing my next Thought Bite with you very soon. Goodbye.